but it's important to remind ourselves when talking about religion and the various religions from a psychological, in this case a Jungian depth psychological point of view, that neither C.G. Jung nor anyone else, and certainly not myself, ever intended that kind of an approach to indicate that it exhausts or it fully covers the meaning resident within that particular religious tradition. The psychological approach is only one of many, but when applied to religious matters, it sheds a certain light upon the content of a religious tradition that otherwise might not be able to come to bear upon it. And it is a very useful and a very valuable light. What kind of a light is it? Well, it is a light that, while we don't know its origins, let's say, shines, to say the least, by way of or through the interiority, if there is such a word. If not, I just coined it, why not, of the mind, of the soul, of the psyche of the human being. While the traditional, the usual, the mainstream approach that the believers, the advocates, the clergy of the various religions adopt toward their own religious tradition is usually of an external and metaphysical character. The psychological approach is internal and tries to understand the various statements of a religious tradition in the light of the powers and potencies and processes that are discernible within the human psyche. Now, there are some people who don't like that approach very much. And the derogatory term psychologism has been applied to it now and then. But I never found that, that accusation to be particularly accurate or useful, because who is to say, even if we work with the metaphysical postulates of a religious tradition, and we accept, let's say, the existence of God, or the divine, or the Tao, in our case this evening, whatever we wish to call it, as a metaphysical existing reality, who is to say that one cannot move toward and possibly arrive at, maybe ultimately enter into a creative relationship with and unite with that greater principle by going within and perhaps eventually through the human psyche. Alan Watts, whom I am apparently ritually invoking every evening here now, it's a sort of, I don't know, he's the guardian spirit of this series or something. Alan Watts had a little pictorial metaphor for that, which I always thought was very apt and, like almost anything that Alan did, very funny. He said, you know, the human being is constituted spiritually, psychologically, somewhat like a donut. And one thing about the donut is that it has an outer outside and an inner outside. Who can argue with that? And he said, well, the usual religious approach and the various other approaches too are to go beyond the human, let's say, self-transcendence by way of the outer outside. We say there is a God, there is Jesus Christ, whoever, Allah, we pray to Him and we go to Him by way of the outer outside. He is out there somewhere. But who is to say that if indeed we are constituted like the Wattsian donut, that if we go inside, eventually we will not exit from our selfhood, our at least our personality, also, and transcend ourselves by way of the inner outside. So in a sense, he implied you can do it both ways. But the problem with religionists is that for the most part they are very fixated on the notion that there is only one way. I'm sure you have heard that expression before, one way. You know? And that is it's particularly characteristic of the monotheistic religions, because that monotheistic model, one God, one law, one way, everything has to be in that unitary fashion. But we find orthodoxies in other religions too. And so I just would like you to consider that the psychological approach to religion is not necessarily all that different in terms of the ultimate desirable outcome of such an approach from the mainstream or metaphysical approach. It merely starts out a different way. And Jung felt, and rightly so, particularly in his time. You must remember the dear old gentleman has been dead since the very beginning of the 1960s. That's quite a while ago. I mean, there weren't even any flower children in San Francisco, and the flowers haven't even bloomed yet on Haight-Ashbury or things like that. And now they have bloomed and withered and gone and been swept up. Although, you know, it's still quite an interesting part of town. I stayed there the last time I was in San Francisco, right in the middle of the Haight-Ashbury district, and you know, even the homeless people, the panhandlers, are different around there from anywhere else. Panhandlers, at least at that time, a couple of years ago in Haight-Ashbury, would recite poetry to you and different things of that sort. It's sort of high-class panhandlers. And there is something to be said for that. So you know, this was a long time ago that Jung worked and brought forth these ideas about the psychology of religion. I think he was very correct for that time, and to a great extent even for this time, that there are, after all, a good many people in our culture, in other cultures as well, and by no means the least valuable, the least conscious, the least deserving of the populace, who can't and won't, at least at this time, relate to the deeper matters of the spirit by way of the outside of the donut. They can't relate to a God or even a Tao out there. But on the other hand, if it's properly presented to them, they do recognize that they have a psyche, maybe they are a psyche, and that in that psyche there are all kinds of astonishing and interesting things. After all, they dream. Most everybody does. In fact, everybody does, only some people don't remember them. And they have synchronistic experiences, they have visionary experiences, they have all sorts of experiences which indicate that something is going on in there. There are powers, there are images, there are processes going on, there are messages coming forth, and it's all right here. You carry it with you wherever you go. A traveling library, a traveling alchemical laboratory, whatever it is, it's with you all the time. Traveling cathedral, your own interior cathedral. So the psychological way, the movement toward and through the inner outside of the donut is a viable proposition for a lot of people in our culture. That is really the true value of a psychological approach to religion. Now, of course, there are psychologists and psychologists, and psychological writers and psychological writers. Even among Jungians there are wide differences. And there certainly are some writers and some people who, are more psychologists than they are people who understand religion. And they will try to reduce the religious categories to a little bit too personalistic, too concrete psychological categories, and they sort of imply and sometimes state that's all there is to it. That, of course, is the wrong approach too, and you do find people like that. But it wasn't really Jung's approach. Jung merely said, I am a psychologist, and I am not qualified to speak of God, angels, saints, whatever other religious categories and images there may be in strictly metaphysical terms. But I know the meaning of these in psychological terms, because that's what I have worked with all my life, and that is what I'm telling you. He did not mean to reduce the meaning to that, but he was qualified to shed that kind of a light. So I think that's useful to bring up every once in a while. Now, the ancient Chinese tradition of Taoism in a psychological light. Jung had a very interesting and very vital connection with Taoism. A lot of people don't know that. It's certainly not true about his connection with Hinduism. He had been to India, didn't like it there very much. And difference between Switzerland and India, I think, is quite considerable, even if you should go into the mountains or whatever. And he had advisors, resource people, such as the great mythographer and scholar of Indian mythology, Heinrich Zimmer, who incidentally was the principal teacher of Joseph Campbell. And the author of some very, very fascinating books, Philosophies of India, and that charming collection and interpretation of myths, both Eastern and Western, under the title The King and the Corpse. If you just want to have some very, very pleasant reading that's also very informative at the same time, take it with you. It's wonderful, wonderful work. So Jung had these people concerning India, but he didn't really have a vital connection with it. With Buddhism, somewhat the same thing. He was quite interested in Vajrayana Buddhism, and he wrote commentaries to some of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Tibetan the Book of the Great Liberation, translated, which is the life of Padmasambhava, translated by W.Y. Evans Wentz and so forth. But it was a different matter with Taoism, and it was like this, just very, very briefly told. You know, Jung's really vital interest, his really vital connection in terms of spiritual traditions from the beginning, from his childhood on, was with Gnosticism. And of course that is what I share with Jung very greatly. He plunged with tremendous dedication into all sources of information concerning Gnosticism from his early life on, as a student already. And by the time he became a medical doctor and then met Sigmund Freud, and then eventually after 1913 split from Sigmund Freud, he has come sort of at the end of the objective written material, the literature of an authentic character relating to Gnosticism or coming from the Gnostics that was available. There wasn't all that much available at that time. It might also interest some of you that one of the authorities, one of the translators and commentators whom he valued most was George R.S. Mead, who of course has some connection with this place and this organization. He was Madame Blavatsky's last personal secretary. He gave the funeral oration a little over 100 years, is it now 101 years ago, at her death. And he was the great informed and sympathetic Gnostic scholar of the turn of the century, in the early part of the century. In fact, I was told by Jung's friend and Gnostic advisor, Professor Gilles Quispel from Holland, from the University of Utrecht at that time, that Jung made a special trip to London in the early 1930s. Within the last couple of years or so of G.R.S. Mead's life, and went to see Mead, who was old and living in what the British call so genteelly in reduced circumstances, which means we don't have any money, a condition which I'm sure none of us know anything about. So he visited Mead, who was living under these circumstances in London, and he specially went there to thank him, to express his great gratitude for all that Mead had done and how much help that was to him in his own studies. And it is not something that you find generally stated, because, you know, the academicians and so forth tend to ignore Mead. After all, he was one of these curious people called Theosophists. And, you know, we are very much worth ignoring. But the problem is that sometimes it doesn't work out. We won't be ignored, and they have to take notice. So, in any event, that this was Jung's early great dedication. And then he sort of came to the end of the line, because the great find of Gnostic materials of the Nag Hammadi library was not available yet, wasn't even discovered yet. So when it came to the 1920s, Jung was sort of casting about for further spiritual material to sink his psychological teeth into, as it were. And as he was thus casting about and stewing, he had a dream. And the dream was unusual even for him. It had two characteristics that he could readily discern. One, that it was Chinese in imagery, and the second, that it was alchemical in meaning as well. And so he had the dream, wrote it down, even made some nice sort of paintings about the dream, about the yellow castle and all of that. And the very next day, a package arrived in the mail. And this package was a manuscript. It was sent to him by Richard Wilhelm, the German gentleman who had lived for many years, I think well over 20 years in China, and who had just come back to Germany from China. And the manuscript was a translation of a highly esoteric Taoist treatise, actually two treatises, I think, little ones combined, and the translation into English of which is The Secret of the Golden Flower. Jung devoured this work with tremendous interest, and it is a work on, perhaps you guessed it by now, and some of you know it, Chinese alchemy. This is the book. It's appeared in various editions. You can get it in a much cheaper Bollingen paperback, and it has two parts. There is the translation of the text with some commentaries by Richard Wilhelm himself, and then it has Jung's psychological commentaries. This was the beginning of Jung's involvement with the Chinese spirituality, with Taoism, which led in due course to his psychological commentaries and introduction to Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching, or Yi King, whichever way you want to translate it. and also Jung's lifetime dedication to and use of the I Ching oracle for himself and at times in his psychological work and otherwise, and his really his great the discovery of his great affinity to certain of the Taoist principles and images and so forth. Tragically enough, Richard Wilhelm was dead within 3 years' time. He died in 1929. Even before the translation of the Secret of the Golden Flower was published, and Jung gave the speech at his funeral. Now that was the beginning of Jung's interest, actually not only in Chinese matters and in Taoism, but in alchemy as well. From the Chinese alchemy, he then proceeded to Western alchemy and wrote all the great books, Psychology and Alchemy, Alchemical Studies, Mysterium Conjunctionis, and different other references. Now, what did Jung see in Taoism? First, maybe just to refresh our memory a little bit before we enumerate the psychological view of Taoist principles, let's say a few things about Taoism itself. In all likelihood, it embodies the primeval traditions of the ancient Chinese people, or of the Mongolian people group, which was concerned with the existence of the unitary principle manifesting as a duality, which then results in a multiplicity. Very, very ancient, very, very old. There is no reliable historical information about when and how Taoism started. It's rather like Shinto, the ancient faith of the Japanese people, which apparently grew from primeval ancient sort of shamanistic beginnings to the present. And these kinds of religions usually don't have any scriptures for a long time because they are pre-literary in their origins. Later on they get scriptures. Well, of course, as Dr. Lisi mentioned a minute ago, there are Taoist scriptures now, and the oldest and the most authoritative is the ancient poetic treatise attributed to Lao Tzu, and which he mentioned, the Tao Te Ching. And then, of course, there are the writings of Chuang Tzu and various other Taoist sages down the line. Lao Tzu, the writer of the Tao Te Ching, was a historical character, born probably around 604 BC, and he was a librarian or the keeper of archives by profession. He is usually referred to as the ancient master, and one of his sort of nicknames combined with his name is the old boy. The reason for which possibly was that, according to tradition, he was born with a beard, with the whiskers. And I don't know whether he ever shaved them off thereafter. In any event, Lao Tzu is regarded, let's say, as a codifier, someone who has given articulation, given utterance to this primeval ancient tradition. And he's certainly not the founder. Now, what can we say about an ancient religious structure of this sort? Just the overall subject in psychological terms. It is, of course, axiomatic almost from a psychological point of view that such a tradition comes from a time of the human spirit, of the human mind, that is still very close to its own origins. Now, psychologically speaking, our origins are in the so-called unconscious. And it simply means, of course, that vast area of the mind which has not risen to conscious manifest expression yet. It is a psychological analog, to say the least, of a transcosmic and pre-cosmic condition alluded to by many different traditions that, let's say, in the certain Hindu traditions might be called the para-Brahman, that which is beyond God, beyond the manifest deity, beyond all things, or something perhaps that Paul Tillich of blessed memory might have called the God above God, God beyond God, that the Gnostics called the pleroma, the fullness. We have something of that sort in our own lives, a plenum of potentiality. The Taoists often call it the uncarved block, where manifestation hasn't taken place yet. And the uncarved block, that plenum of the unconscious, is the sort of energy field, psychic energy field, within which all things exist potentially, but nothing is really out there fully in actuality. You see, let's say if you are a wood carver or a sculptor, if you have that uncarved block, with the artist's eye, you can look at it and you can see all sorts of things in there potentially. There is a man that you could carve out of it, a woman, or a dog, or a horse, or I don't know, the Statue of Liberty, or whatever. That's all in there, potentially. The great mystery, the great unconscious. And so these primeval, ancient, sort of slowly developed religious traditions, Taoism, Shintoism, are very close to that source. And consequently, their symbolism, their way of expressing themselves is psychologically very meaningful to someone who is interested in the mysteries of the unconscious. More so than, let's say, a much more rational and much more ego-produced religious structure such as Christianity or even Islam. These are far more differentiated religious structures. So no doubt you can see the reason for Jung's interest in Taoism. And of course, that's how the Taoist world picture, the Taoist world view, is very much along this line of a primeval vision. For one thing, there is no deity at all mentioned in Taoism. Not, let's say, the monotheistic deity that we would expect from a Jewish, Christian, and Islamic or Zoroastrian background. Not the polytheistic pantheon that would be like the Hindus. Not even the sort of the compromises that we find in Mahayana Buddhism, where there is no one God, but there are deific beings, quite a lot of them. Dhyani Buddhas and Dhyani Bodhisattvas and Buddhas and so on and so forth. Beautiful things. None of that. There is the Tao. Tao, which literally means the way. And I'll explain a little more about what the psychological meaning of that is. And it's not the way like we would say a road or a path, this is the way to go, but it is the way things are. You know, the way things are supposed to be. A sort of universal patterning presence that makes everything the way it is. The underlying ordering presence in all things, Tao, the One. And its symbol is usually something that you see a lot represented nowadays. It has become sort of popular in the, I guess, in the 60s, and then it entered the the New Age, and it's all over the place, and it is called the yin-yang symbol. Well, that is really that circle divided into half in that wave-like fashion into light and dark. That circle is the Tao. But as you can see, the Tao in turn divides into two great principles, the yin and the yang. Duality, primeval, ever-present duality, the one manifests by way of the two. So you have a reconciliation, the presence right away from the very beginning of let's say, points of view which in the West people are still arguing about. And do they argue about? And when they argue about it in the East too, people will argue no matter where they are, East or West or North or South, as you know. So, and that is the monism and dualism. Is everything one or is everything two? And you can add another one too, is everything many? You know? And the Taoists don't argue. They say, yes, everything is one and everything is also two. So there. You know? Don't worry about it. That's the way it works. You know? And it really means that from the one come the great polarities, and their interactions and combinations with each other produce the myriad other things that are in the world. So from the one, the two, from the two, the many. And the yin and the yang dualities, of course, have their, they have all kinds of symbols for them, and that's what they are. This is the way that people try to apprehend them. They say, well, the yang principle is rather like the heavens, like the sky. And the yin principle is rather like the earth. And the sky is envisioned as clear and sunny, and therefore it's usually represented as white or some light color. And the earth is represented as dark, also day and night. The masculine and the feminine enter into that too. The sky envisioned as masculine, as the yang in that respect, the earth as yin. I held conversations with various people I knew who are Chinese, who grew up in China in the countryside and so on. And I said, well, tell me, you know, like how, as a child and so, what did you consider yang and what did you consider yin? What is sort of the popular notion? And this one person told me, well, for instance, when we're in the house, the parts of the house that are lighted up and are where we can see what's where in the light, that's yang. And the dark corners and the shadowy places, those are yin. So I said, well, which one did you like better? Oh, I said the yang, because there I wasn't afraid of anything. And you're afraid of the dark and the shadowy places, who knows what's there? And something might come out at you, you know. So these are the kind of the popular implications of the issue. And then soon we'll go into the details. But let's say, what does this amount to, this concept ultimately? Well, what it amounts to is that there is an underlying truth, authenticity, rightness of being. Now that doesn't mean that everything is true and authentic and right that you encounter in life, far from it. But underneath it all, behind it all, sort of at the bedrock, there is the Tao. The way, the true way, the right way, the authentic way. And the problem is that we, and perhaps other beings too, because especially as Taoism sort of unfolds, in later Taoism, the Chuang-Tzu and others, then recognition is given to all kinds of spirits and entities, and Taoists are great magicians, great healers, like sort of people from a shamanistic tradition usually are. They have a lot to do with dragons, which is a nice thing, you know. I always liked dragons, great devotee of Tolkien and his dragon Smaug and other things. But of course the dragons are spirits that sometimes appear physically as well. And that goes on right up to the present time. Somewhere in my, if I can call them my files, my mixed up balderdash of papers, which is driving me out of my house, there's so much of it. I have an old cutting from Time magazine, you know, which is sort of one of the sacred scriptures of our country. You know, it's sort of the New Testament, perhaps. The Old Testament undoubtedly is the Reader's Digest. You know. You got those two, and you have it. You know. In any event, in Time magazine, maybe about a dozen or 15 years ago or so, a very objective report from Hong Kong. They were building attempting to erect a large building, some kind of a high-rise in a part of Hong Kong. And they had no end of troubles. The foundations would sink, things would crack, and in sort of unexplainable ways that the geologists and nobody could explain. The building just didn't make any progress. Finally, the architects called in the Taoist priests. And they threw the I Ching and they burned the incense and did all of their magic rites. And then they reported, they said, well, it's simple. There's a dragon underneath the building. When you have a dragon underneath the building, it's very difficult to build. So said the architect, what are we to do? Well, two things. Either you go and build elsewhere where there is no dragon, or we will try to get rid of the dragon. We'll exorcise him, and then maybe things will be all right. So they were commissioned to exorcise the dragon, and they worked on it. They brought other Taoist priests, and they threw more I Ching, and they did various other rites for quite a while, day and night. And then finally they reported, we think now it'll be all right. So they continued with the construction, no trouble at all anymore. Well, I can't tell you what the dragons are like, but they have dragons, and they have spirits, and they have all that sort of thing, also, of course. But the issue is that various beings, and humans particularly, have a way of, well, messing up the Tao. They can do that. And that is why the world is flawed, and that is why we have all these difficulties in the world. Because we interfere with the Tao. We can do that. And when we interfere with the Tao, then things don't work right. So the Taoist principle is not so much the Western idea, let's fix it, like I said earlier on, probably last night. You know, we are a tradition and a culture of fixers. We are forever trying to fix things, and of course, as soon as we fixed one thing, the other thing falls down. By the time we fix that, the stuff that we fixed before falls down, and so we are always at it, fixing things. The Taoists say it's not so much a matter of fixing things that have gone wrong, but remove the interference which caused the wrongfulness in the first instance. Stop interfering. Stop interfering with the Tao. If you let the Tao be, it will do as it will, and it will be all right, because the Tao is the ultimate rightness. But this rightness can be interfered with, and then you have trouble. Now, look at the difference. You see, this is where the differences in religious thinking, in what the German calls grandiloquently, with Wagnerian pomposity, die Weltanschauung. You know? It's the sort of thing that should be sung by an opera diva with a great big chest and a horns, on the head, Valkyrie or something like that. But the religiously motivated worldview, cosmoconception, is of tremendous importance. And you talk about people understanding each other, you talk about world peace and world harmony and global village and whatever the shibboleths may be, unless there is a clear understanding of the, both the similarities and the differences in religious worldviews, none of that is going to happen. The fine people who, for instance, initiated 100 years ago the parliament, what was it called, World Parliament of Religions, all right, let's be correct about it. They really focused in on that sort of thing, and many people, such as the Theosophists and others, were very anxious to point out the similarities. That look, there is a basis of agreement. Let's not always fight each other because we are of different religions, and that's a very, very important recognition. But at the same time, we also need to recognize the dissimilarities, because upon that understanding and recognition rests also the chance of understanding and of sympathy. We have not included Islam in this particular series because I understand somebody just did, I think, a program on Islam not long ago, but I'll come back to Taoism in just an instant, but let me show you how important these things are. After World War I couldn't give you the exact date, but I imagine 1920, 1919, somewhere around there. A conference was convened in which the heads of the newly formed Arab political units, Iraq, for instance, which was a newly formed country at that time under the Hashemite kings, and so forth, came together, and the guiding genius of the conference was Colonel Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, and the other party in the conference were the Zionist leaders of the Jewish people like Theodor Herzl and his disciples, who were, of course, on the basis of the Balfour Declaration, and so working on the future establishment of the State of Israel, which did not come to pass until the next war. All right. So, and what the conference was really about was to explore the possible receptivity ultimately of the Arab leaders to the Jewish homeland idea, which of course still gives us a lot of trouble everywhere. And there was not such great antagonism at that time. And one of the ways that Lawrence wanted to negotiate this was he knew that the Jewish leaders had access to a great deal of money by way of the Rothschilds and others. The Arabs, on the other hand, needed a great deal of money to establish their new countries. And he thought, well, we can buy some goodwill through loans and so forth to the Arab countries. And this was mentioned, and everyone seemed to be in agreement until the Jewish leaders mentioned, well, we can do that, we can arrange for these loans at such and such a figure of interest. And the Arabs got up and walked out. And everyone said, why? What's the matter? What did we say wrong? Well, interest is against the religious law of Islam. It is something that the Prophet forbade. It is called usury. And to ask somebody to pay interest is to ask him to commit a sin against the Sharia, against the religious law. Now you can call it something else. You can call it a carrying charge, like some of our companies do, and you can work it out in some other way, but don't call it interest. And you know what? Never since then did Arabs and Jews ever get together. Never. Now, how do you like that? And what was at fault was the lack of understanding of the other party's religion. You've got to understand the other party's religion. Momentous consequences can hang on this. Now, to us, in a secular kind of society, post-Christian society, whatever it is, this sort of seems ridiculous. But whether it is rational or not, whether it is ridiculous or not, this is the way things are all over the world. And if you want to have some kind of an understanding with people, you have to understand their religion, and you have to work your way with that.